would it actually be good for us if God had a 6 meter tall incarnation, or wrote his Jesus is Lord in that genetic code, or wrote in the sky every night at 5 p.m. through the clouds, I am God? Would that actually be good for us? If there's a fundamental resistance in the human heart to God, then just bombardment of miracles is not actually necessarily for our good. It's also good to ask our friends, what are you expecting in terms of God's revelation in light of who God is? It's also not clear that a bombardment of miracles is necessarily the clearest revelation of God. Because, like one of the points that comes up in the philosophical literature about this is that
Dr. Ortland, I watched your video on divine hiddenness recently, and I thought it was fantastic. A lot of the arguments that you brought up that deal directly with really the perspective of Alex O'Connor, but through some other books that are important, and really a much longer conversation that has gone into church history and really human history. And I thought the way that you put a lot of those pieces together was extremely helpful in the way that you condensed a lot of big ideas down. And so I'm extremely excited to just kind of dig into that and expose my audience to this huge and not just philosophical or abstract question, but a very real, raw human question about why does it seem so often that God is more hidden than we expect that he should be or would be if he were really like the God of the Bible presents him as. And so I guess, first of all, welcome. And by way of intro, can you sort of just, for those who aren't familiar, just give us sort of a bird's eye view of divine hiddenness. What is this? And I guess, why does it matter?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm happy to talk about this. And like you said, this argument is very human. It's very kind of existentially rooted and very practical. I think a lot of believers can struggle with it. And in fact, maybe that's the first thing we can say, is that the problem of divine hiddenness in a non-technical sense is not a new argument, nor is it an argument for atheism. It's just a perennial struggle that is within the tradition of faith. You can read the Psalms of Lament, and you can read the book of Job, and you can see this is not a new emotional feeling to wonder, God, where are you? That's and of course, we'll talk about the cross at some point too, and the pinnacle moment of the life of Christ, the cry of dereliction, where he says, "Why have you forsaken me?" to God, quoting Psalm 22. So that's just interesting, kind of in the background here. But as an argument for God's against God's existence, it does have kind of a newer technical life. It's often traced to a 1993 book by John Schellenberg, an outstanding philosopher. And then he's written a newer, a little more accessible, shorter book on it from 2015. And, there are different versions of it, but the core idea of it, you could kind of locate in two foundational ideas: divine love and non-resistant non-belief. And so basically, the intuition that drives the argument is that if there's a perfectly loving God, then non-resistant non-belief will not occur. And that is among those who are open to relationship with God and capable of relationship with God, where their non-belief is not caused by resistance to God. And basically, it's saying, that wouldn't be there if there was a perfectly loving God, but it is there. Therefore, there is no perfectly loving God. And, more colloquially, we could kind of just put it by saying something like, if God existed, it would be a lot more clear. If God existed, it would be a lot more plain. Like, you wouldn't expect this like really ambiguous struggle to get to it if he was in fact out there. And of course, we can be put other ways as well. So that's kind of an initial, just really broad foray of kind of getting us into it here.
It makes me think of, there was a clip that you played in your original video on this where it was from I think it was from Unbelievable podcast or something, but it was Alex O'Connor, and he was saying that it would be so bizarre that God would reveal himself in some wriggle under a microscope, is I think how he put it, when in the real world people struggle with pain and loss and just sometimes an existential feeling of his absence. It would be bizarre if it were merely a matter of something that could be placed under a microscope. And I think that's a great point. And it's funny because a lot of times in conversations that are of an apologetics nature, we kind of do talk about these arguments as if it's all just ideation, as if we're just philosophizing about God like he's an object of mere inquiry or speculation. And I think that I love this topic because it gets down to the real world and the human experience. And I think that ultimately, I'm also, I guess, thinking of that survey that you mentioned in your video where the atheist experience found that 85% of the people who responded to that survey said that they did not want there to be a God. And I think, was that right? Was it that they didn't want there to be a God, or that they wouldn't worship one if there was?
I think that's right. Just I want to be so careful. I think that it was if God revealed himself to you in some way, or if you became aware of God, would you worship him?
That's right.
Because I might have made a mistake previously in saying, would you believe in him? But I think it's worship. And they said
Hmm.
no.
But it's still, yeah, but it does get to the relationship between will and belief. And I think that that's something that you talked about in your video that I think is really important. And so I guess maybe you can unpack that a little bit for us. What are the, I guess, commonly held ideas about how does your desire for something affect your belief in that something? Or I don't know. You had a few interesting points about that I think are very relevant towards, again, just God in the abstract versus a God that we can actually know or would want to know.
Yeah. Well, first, just to extend kind of in agreement with some of the things you've already said of just the relevance of this argument and the kind of human relatable nature of it. Probably all of us, whether the people watching this are an atheist or a believer or somewhere in between, or they're not sure, probably all of us can relate to when you're trying to figure out some of these deep questions of life and it feels very abstract and hard to kind of touch and hard to kind of relate to in either direction. And this is one thing I love about this argument. And I think it's really important for us to think about it because I think it really seems to be an argument. It's almost like an argument that like Gen Z and millennials can relate to more than boomers or something like that. I don't even know why I would think of it exactly. It feels like a lot of young people struggle with intellectual anxiety and this sense of I'm perplexed at all the options. We're more aware of religious pluralism than we were hundreds of years ago. We're more aware of evolutionary psychology. We're more prone to kind of wonder, how could I possibly know the truth? And I think this argument is really powerful right now because it taps into some of those anxieties that are in the human heart right now. So all that is just kind of in the spirit of just the importance of this and in agreement with some of your comments. On the relation of will and belief, I think one of the things that Schellenberg says is that believing is involuntary. And I really don't want to caricature him. He may qualify that a little bit. And then Alex O'Connor, who is a YouTuber that I really enjoy watching, has talked about how he feels like, he couldn't necessarily just choose to believe in God. And, in the dialogue you referenced, I think he was kind of saying like, some of these arguments are powerful, but I can't just make myself believe. And one of the things I was going into in my video is just, this is so complicated because we can't just choose what we believe, but we can influence our beliefs through our relationships, our choices, our will. And so, one of the things this argument gets into is just how complicated our decision-making process is. And that'll come up too with this whole idea of non-resistance.
So maybe we should cut down to the chase, which you brought up a minute ago, but why I think one of the analogies that you used or referenced was, what if when God incarnated himself, he was, what would you say, 6 meters tall instead of 6 feet tall? So, I've heard William Lane Craig say, why doesn't it say in the genetic code instead of random, or not random, but instead of letters in a certain combination, why doesn't it say Jesus Christ is Lord, Jesus Christ is Lord on repeat? And there's a bunch of ways of getting at this idea, but can you unpack, I guess, that as an expectation, which is what you previously discussed, and then you made an interesting point that that's not necessarily a more effective, that wouldn't be a necessarily more effective way at getting at what God is getting at with humans. And I think that was so interesting. And I want you to kind of unpack that for my audience.
Yeah. The 6 meter tall incarnate person ideas from Kierkegaard. That's one of his ideas. And if nothing else that I say in this is heard by people, I hope they'll hear this one thing, and that is to check out Kierkegaard and Blaise Pascal, who are the two Christian thinkers in the Christian tradition that I think speak most powerfully to this question, and they can certainly help people far more than I could. I'm just trying to channel Kierkegaard and Pascal in many of my comments in my video in the context of that 6 meter tall incarnation or 6 yards comment. What Kierkegaard is saying is that wouldn't be for our good. If God came, because the whole point of the incarnation is that God comes in incognito. Pascal has a passage where he says, "Don't deride us for worshiping a hidden God. This is precisely what the prophets anticipate and proclaim. We worship a hidden God. This is the glory of our religion, that God sneaks into a tiny manger. He's an ordinary carpenter. When God becomes a man, he doesn't come with fanfare and applause. He dies on a cross." This is a very different kind of revelation, but Kierkegaard and Pascal are saying this is actually the kind of revelation that we need, because our deepest, just to state maybe the main thing right up front, and knowing this will be maybe offensive to some, but what they say is the Christian message is our main need isn't perfect intellectual clarity. Our main need is the changing of our will. In Christianity, there's this word sin, which means a deep brokenness, a fundamental brokenness in all of us, internally and in our relationships, in our orientation. And so that's our main problem, and that a direct revelation wouldn't necessarily resolve that problem. So they're talking about how in the Bible, when there's miracles, people respond really badly a lot of times. Many times it'll be like Pharaoh hardening his heart. The more plagues come, the more he hardens his heart. And the 85% figure at least raises this question of, would it actually be good for us if God had a 6 meter tall incarnation, or wrote his Jesus is Lord in the genetic code, or wrote in the sky every night at 5 p.m. through the clouds, "I am God"? Would that actually be good for us? If there's a fundamental resistance in the human heart to God, then just bombardment of miracles is not actually necessarily for our good. And maybe, that's a really that's a point that is nuanced enough that we can keep canvassing this as you want and kind of circle that and kind of explore that a little bit. But the other thing I'll just briefly say is it's also good to ask our friends, what are you expecting in terms of God's revelation in light of who God is? It's also not clear that a bombardment of miracles is necessarily the clearest revelation of God, because like one of the points that comes up in the philosophical literature about this is that conscience in some respects is a more reliable form of communication from God than a burning bush. And I think there's some reasons to at least give that point some consideration. So conscience being the revelation of God's moral nature in this kind of deeply intuitive way that's like stamped on our heart. We just have a sense that good and evil matter, and that they're robust categories, fixed categories that have significance at a transcendent level. We all feel that. So if I was getting a burning bush like Moses in Exodus 3, I would be getting information that in some respects is more questionable than the information I'm getting from conscience. The burning bush could be an alien, it could be a hallucination, or it could be a demon. But conscience is telling me something that is an eternal truth, that love is good. And so I understand that that could be frustrating for someone who's really in the travail of struggle about this, but I'm just at least wanting to put it out on the table for us to start, working through.
Yeah, and I will say that I actually have, I think, a little issue with that, just because of what I'm thinking of is the burning of the bosom that the Mormon talks about, or the felt experience of Allah that maybe could be talked about from an Islamic perspective, or the New Age sort of Christ consciousness within that we have always had and discover upon meditation. But at the same time, I know that the law is written in our hearts. Eternity is in our hearts. And I see what you're saying as well. Maybe this is where the word of God also comes into play as a measuring tool for the conscience, where if your conscience is telling you to kill your baby and you end up on the front page of the newspaper, you can know that that was not God speaking to you, because it directly refuted his law and his morality. Do you kind of see where I'm coming with this?
Yeah, no, that's a great point that you raise. And I would make a distinction between general religious experience on the one hand, and on the other hand, the specific data given to us at the level of conscience, which is of a moral nature.
Hmm.
So, a burning in the bosom or something like this could be just a feeling of love or transcendence, but it wouldn't necessarily be giving us moral information about good versus evil. Now,
Hmm.
it is true that even the conscience as a form of revelation is not exhaustive. It doesn't get you to a particular deity necessarily. It doesn't necessarily tell you that it's the Trinity versus a Unitarian God. That's certainly true. That's true for all general revelation. And it's also true that it's not flawless because there are psychopaths. And now, even most psychopaths, they still have conscience. Usually, in those cases, it's very rare with psychopathy for someone to have completely no moral intuitions. Usually they're just malformed or imperfect or something, or muted, but they're still there to some extent. But there are
Hmm.
those, but we all recognize those are abnormal. We all kind of recoil when we meet a psychopath who has no moral intuitions. We all kind of recoil at that and feel this is abnormal. This is a deviation from the standard.
Hmm.
So I'm not trying to say too much with conscience beyond just that. What I think the scripture says, and that's Romans 2 and elsewhere, that it's a testimony of God.
This video is sponsored by Atlas VPN, and there are 6 main reasons that I'm choosing to tell you guys about this particular company. Number 1, if you're already a VPN person, Atlas is currently offering the best price on the market. It's a Black Friday price cut where you can get their premium service for $1.70 per month plus 6 months extra. Pretty good deal. Number 2, if you're not a VPN person, one FYI here is that by using Atlas, you can access Netflix or whatever your streaming service is while in another country, which is obviously a great deal. Number 3, with Atlas VPN, you can search the web without companies tracking your activity, selling your data, turning you into a commodity, which if you're like me, I like my privacy. I don't like being commodified. Number 4, if you have Atlas, it blocks malicious links, ads, trackers, and it notifies you when someone is trying to steal your data. Number 5, it helps you get the best deals while shopping online, which is really cool because you can probably make back the price of the software really quick using the advantage that the software gives you. So I like that as well. And last, a single subscription covers all of your devices, which is obviously great. So that's it. Click the link in the description. Check them out. Thank me later. Now back to the conversation. There's a desire for love through the will that God has, not just raw belief. And I think that story points towards that. So I don't know, maybe share that story and anything else that you want to wrap around it.
Sure. I love this story. And I may even get emotional talking about it because it's such a beautiful, poignant way. I mean, this is one thing about the Christian imagination is it certainly kind of has a beauty and a charm to it. So I'll explain the metaphor and then I'll maybe make the point from the metaphor that I take from it. And I think Kierkegaard is kind of gesturing towards. This is from Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments, a text he wrote. And the idea is a king falls in love with a poor maiden, and he is trying to figure out, what do I do? How do I establish a relationship with her? And he realizes, and he's discussing it with his subjects, and he realizes if I were to just walk right up to her and say, I'm the king, I want to date you or something like this, there's some negatives to that. Number one, I wouldn't necessarily know, is she just doing this because I'm the king and she just wants to get into a more lavish lifestyle as the queen? And number two, it might intimidate her and it might drive her away. It's not the ideal circumstance in which to fall in love with someone, because there's so many other dynamics involved. And so he's trying to figure out all these different scenarios, and just cutting to the chase, he realizes the best way to do it is to become a poor beggar himself. And he lives next to her as a poor beggar and enters into that lifestyle. And in the context of that, pursues her and they fall in love. And the idea of the metaphor in part is to help us to envision God's intention in the kind of revelation he has given us, especially with the incarnation of Jesus. So the Christian idea is that God became a man, God became a person, a creature, and that's Jesus Christ. And then Jesus effected a way for us to have salvation and reunion with God. And I guess what gives that such plausibility to me is related to what we got into a little bit ago from the 85% figure, and just what I know in my own life, what is in my own heart, and as I look around, especially at human history, but also at the world right now. I think it's a plausible idea that there is a lot of resistance to God. I think the basic idea of sin makes a lot of sense. You know, the old Christian idea that we're all broken, we're all cut out, we're all kind of twisted because we've fallen away from our Creator. And so, if there is a resistance to God, then it makes sense to me that the kind of revelation that would be most effective at establishing relationship and love would be one that doesn't just sort of provide perfect clarity for the mind, though it needs sufficient clarity, and we can talk about that, but also is designed to address what is our deepest problem, and that is our will and our resistance. And you know, another way to put it is perhaps the God we need is not a 6-meter tall incarnate God, but a incarnate God who's dying on a cross, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
So to me, that addresses the 85% or the, in some sense, merciful rationale behind hiddenness on behalf of the 85% who would say, no, I do not want to worship you. I would rather be the center of my own life. Thank you very much. But for the 15% who would at least claim, and I would put Alex O'Connor in this category, and I think that I have friends who are also in this category, where they genuinely seem to feel that they would say, I desire God. They would say, I want some revelation of God. And I've even heard them say to me personally, you know, I'm kind of jealous of, it seems that you have a connection with God, and I wish that I did have that, but I don't seem to. And that for me is a trickier one. And I've tried to, well, what I've said to those people at a personal level is just to, I think I got this from Tim Keller, who says to train your heart with your actions. And he was talking about marriage. That was in his book, Meaning of Marriage. But essentially, do what you would do if you did have the connection that I have, which is sort of also like the Jordan Peterson idea of live as if God were real. And I do think that there's a connection between like obedience and like at least respecting the possibility of God that actually can lead to spiritual enlightenment. But anyways, I'm talking too much, Gavin. Beyond that, what do you make of that 15%? In the way in your video, you said the people who are more on the fence, who are probably watching a channel like yours or mine, but are also watching a channel like Cosmic Skeptic, and they're sort of analyzing all of this information in conjunction with the self. What's going on with this group of people?
Yeah. No, I'm kind of tracking with your thoughts about this and wanting to be cautious about this. I know a lot of people like this myself, where so the first thing I can say is I think the last thing we should do is start questioning people's motives and immediately making judgments or immediately assuming things or telling people, well, you may say you're non-resistant, but you really don't mean it, or something like that. That's uncharitable because it doesn't assume the best in others. And I think that's not a helpful way to respond. Now, if someone is leveraging this argument against us as an absolutely certain deductive argument, then I do think it may be appropriate to at least introduce some question marks about this 15% category. Number one, is it really 15%? I don't think ultimately, I think claims about non-resistance are very tricky to measure. They're claims about a state of mind. And I think it is good to be cautious, because I would basically say, I don't think we can know others' states of minds. I don't even think we can fully know our own. And sometimes it's hard to know, like even for believers, I think at times we can have the experience where we have different kinds of resistance and non-resistance going on either at the same time, or it can be back and forth. So I think we kind of need to introduce some complexity to that and allow that, kind of leave space there. So that's what I will say when someone like Schellenberg is arguing that, like, well, non-resistance was kind of, he gives the impression this was kind of the default before monotheism came along. And I do think there are ways we can kind of push back against that when there's overreach like that, because I think the amount of non-resistance can be exaggerated sometimes. And in my video, I kind of go through all of that. But for the fifth, okay, so beyond just kind of raising some cautions about that, though, to try to be helpful, I think I need to kind of sort of bite the bullet in a sense here and acknowledge the real difficulty of this. And that's where I want someone to feel as though I'm kind of entering into the struggle with them. Ultimately, I feel that there are strong reasons to believe in God. You know, Pascal said there's enough light for those who want to see, but there's enough darkness for those who don't. It's not super clear, but ultimately, I think there are strong reasons, but they're not so strong that there's no place for people to really struggle. And sometimes, it's hard. I mean, it's the pathway of faith is not easy. And I want people to sort of feel some level of sympathy. I may not always know, like with someone like Alex O'Connor, whom I assume to be in sincerity in his comments. I don't know that I would really have an answer for him in terms of his personal experience. When he's saying, I've prayed, I've done all these things, and I just haven't heard from God, at a certain point, I would get to a point where my main response would be kind of like, I'm perplexed with you. I'm trusting that something good will come about eventually. I'm not hopeless because we're temporal. So things can follow differently over time that something might happen 5 years from now. And so this is not a hopeless situation, but I'm perplexed with you. That's kind of my heart posture at that point. One of the metaphors I talk about in my video that I come back to a lot that I find helpful is from the movie Home Alone, where I love this. We watch it at Christmas time with my kids. They love all the ending scenes, but there's this character who's, I think his name is Old Man Marley. He's always shoveling the ice, and Kevin and his brothers are afraid of him because they think he's this evil person. But then it's only through time and the unfolding of the plot that Kevin actually comes to realize he's actually a benevolent person, and he ends up helping Kevin at a key point in the movie. And I think we just have to realize too that our expectations about our experience of God and about God's love do have this kind of dynamic narrative element to them. If we can be mistaken in our expectations of our relationship with God and what that will feel like and how we will experience that, if that kind of thing can happen with a human person, how much more with God? Because our relationship with God is absolutely qualitatively unique. So I guess I'm wanting to introduce patience for people in the process. And then my practical advice, if someone is saying like, I think theism is rationally plausible, like I think it's possible, I'm not a hardcore atheist. And number two, I want it to be true. My counsel at that point is, number one, I just want to be a friend however I can to that person. And number two, I want to encourage them to really do what you talked about with Jordan Peterson of kind of acting on it a little bit. And I think prayer will be key. I just think, one of the wisest prayers and best prayers that I've ever prayed when I've been through times of doubt that I commend to others who maybe are in this is, God, if you are real, show me, and I would just encourage someone, because of the stakes of this, to pray that prayer relentlessly and persevere with that prayer. And then all I can do at that point is trust with them that God will work in their life, and then be heartbroken and perplexed with them if they're continuing to struggle. I kind of want them to feel like I'm alongside them in the journey. So that's the approach I take. I realize that could be some might feel that that's a compromise because of Romans 1, where it says, everybody knows about God's nature. But I just think there's enough ups and downs along the way that calls for a lot of patience for us when we're trying to walk with someone through these confusing seasons, I guess.
That's really helpful. And you also just reminded me of something that I had intended to say in the intro that I did not, which is that this entire conversation is probably not that helpful for someone who is in a place where they think that the idea of God is just utterly ridiculous, and they're going to jump straight to the comment section and start talking about Sky Daddy and Spaghetti Monster. And it's that this is, in my opinion, like downstream from helping someone see that, for example, that we can't see God in the material world. That doesn't mean that there's no evidence of God, and that's a whole other conversation. But I do think that you just reminded me that this is more so for the people who, and frankly, like myself, and this kind of ties into how this intersects with the problem of pain, or the problem of suffering, or the problem of evil, where, I'll just be honest about this. In the past several years, we've been trying to build a family, and we've lost 3 along the way in that journey. And my wife and I are here saying, God, we're trying to do things your way. We're trying to be fruitful and multiply. What are we doing wrong here? How do we, what's up with this? And that's a little bit more of the problem of suffering, but there is still a sense of, in moments like that, like you did the video of Liam Neeson crying out, well, what's going on with this? Where are you? And that's a very real, I guess just by way of sharing space, I want to say that is an experience that can be had in seasons and moments for believers. That's something that I've personally experienced just in the last couple of years. And that feeling of, I wish that you would do more to solve the problem that we have, to answer the prayer that we have. That's something that believers can also relate to. And you see that in the scripture as well. You see people wrestling with God. You see, I think of what psalm is it? I'm gonna not remember it right now off the top of my head, but it's a psalm that is extremely, it's filled with anguish. But what I would argue, the one thing that the psalmist does right is he turns his anguish towards God and he brings it to God. And I really believe that is an important facet of this. Is there's sort of like two responses. You can either be suffering either makes you or it breaks you. And I think that happens along the lines of, are you going to move away from ultimate reality or use those things to lean into ultimate reality? And it's a little bit of a tangent, but I just wanted to share that, I guess, on a personal level, to say Christians also experience that their expectations of what we think God should do in a particular moment, he doesn't always do. And sometimes you find yourself just pondering it. So for whatever that's worth.
I want to thank you so much for sharing that. And it kind of resonates with me as well. And as a way to kind of extend your comments there, for viewers who are struggling themselves, maybe someone's watching this video or listening and they have those feelings of anguish at, like, Lord, where are you? Well, if it's not a total comfort, but it's at least some measure of comfort for them to know that they are not alone in that experience. Like, that's an extremely common experience. And one thing that this can also be a caution to people who are too glib about this topic, to say that does not mean someone has weak faith. Because as you look at the Christian tradition, you find these incredibly godly and intelligent people who really struggle with the dark night of the soul, which is an old idea from John of the Cross, where your intellect cannot comprehend and you're sort of submitting into the darkness. In the video I made, I gave Mother Teresa as an example, her journals, where she's at times crying out in anguish at feeling forsaken by God. And then C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, which he wrote at the tail end of his life after his wife died. I think he was like 2 or 3 years before he himself died. So he was this seasoned apologist and very intelligent man. And people didn't believe he was the author because it was published with a pseudonym. And it was very raw at the sense of God's hiddenness. And then, of course, we have the Psalms of Lament, and we have Job and Lamentations. And then, of course, we have Christ himself. I mean, Christ himself went through this horrific experience that needs to be interpreted, properly and responsibly, but nonetheless, Christ himself experienced like some kind of abandonment, some kind of sense of forsakenness when he was on the cross. And so interpreting that correctly, nonetheless, we still arrive upon those emotions. And that can maybe just be an encouragement for someone to say, if nothing else, just don't assume that you're like, I'm not a real Christian, or I must have not have strong enough faith or something like that, because this seems to be a common experience among godly believers and mature believers.
Yeah, and I think that you just brought up the dark night of the soul, and I do want to underscore, because we're sounding a bit of downer here, although it is so important to recognize this. But I do want to say this as well, that as much as it is currently the case that for Alex O'Connor, he's saying, I've prayed, I've cried out, I've read Christian literature, I've gone to seminary, I've gone to worship, and nothing, not once, not a little bit, He has his thing about that. But as much as that is true for him, I can personally speak to, and I know this is true for many, many others, that is definitely not normative. What is normative is that when you seek, you relatively quickly begin to find. When you knock, you relatively quickly begin to hear the door open. And by relatively quickly, I don't mean like it's a magic trick. For me, it was a year-long process of during college going down to the beach at night and basically howling at the moon, basically just like Liam Neeson. I don't understand. I don't understand hell. I don't understand how you could be good in light of it. I don't understand where you are if you're really real, and all these things. But I just, for whatever reason, by God's grace, brought those questions to him and really just howled out in the night to him. And by a process, he began to encounter me through people, through his word, through community, through worship, through prayer. He began to deal with those things in terms of the questions, but also in terms of my heart, to a point where it is now utterly undeniable to me. There's nothing that could ever change my opinion about God to the extent that I have now encountered him personally. So that is the flip side to the coin, is that and I'm also thinking about in the Middle East, this statistic, I don't know if you're familiar with it, that 25% of people who come to Christ do so having been visited by him in a dream or a vision with a specific thing. Go to the market tomorrow at noon. There's a man wearing an orange shirt. He has a message to tell you. When that person responds to that thing in the dream, they go to the market. There's a man in an orange shirt, and he tells them the gospel. They enter the church. This is also happening on planet Earth right now. And to me, that's a also non-normative on the other end of the extreme, where it's like God's mechanism for bringing salvation to the ends of the world is people. That's what he said, you go to the ends of the world. But sometimes when it's a closed country and this and that, God can also get creative and can actually do some burning bush-like stuff even in the modern era. So I'm only saying all of these things to say that there is definitely a spectrum of experience where God's hiddenness is extremely intricate. It's not like God is a uniformly... he doesn't act the same way at all times and for all people. And so I think that because, for example, Alex O'Connor, we keep talking about him, but he's someone who has a big platform and has a big voice and has a big brain. And so we love Alex, but I do want to say that his experience is just that. It's one experience. And alongside of it are millions of others of people who have said that I seeked and I found, and there's no one like Jesus. And that's what I would say as well. So I guess I just wanted to highlight that it's complicated in that regard as well, but don't be defeated by a singular narrative.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, the testimonial power of what Alex has shared and others share is kind of matched by other testimonies on the other side. And so all of that, you kind of have to, again, it's more the process of wrestling with all of this. And I would want to encourage people who are themselves in the process of wrestling and maybe feeling like, gosh, I can see it either way. I'm not sure what to do. And how do I get past my own doubts and my own unbelief and so forth, to consider the compassion of Christ as he's portrayed in the Gospels. He's the kind of person, he's like Aslan in the Narnia books. On the one hand, you're kind of scared of him because he's so fierce. And, if we ever have the idea in our minds that goodness is bland and mild, we will be disabused of that by reading through the Gospels and seeing how Christ, the demons shriek from him, but he's also so gentle. And so he's fierce, he's wild. And yet, one thing about the character of Christ in the Gospels you see is that when there are people who humbly and sincerely come to him in faith, Christ is very responsive to that. And so I would want to encourage people, if you humble yourself before Christ and cast yourself on his compassion, he will respond. If he's there at all, he will respond eventually. Now, that's where the dynamic temporal nature of this comes in. It's not, as you say, it's not always right away. But that might just be something to help people, for people to put their minds upon in the process and in the travail of that, is to think of the compassion of Christ and just to put your trust in that. For me, like you, I've had my experiences back and forth this way and that, but I've come to, and God has used those experiences in my life for good in some respects. But what I've come to is to basically say, I'm literally going to stake my everlasting status, what's going to happen to me for all eternity, on the compassion of Christ. I'm going to stake everything on that because I think it's worth trusting him. And you get to this existential place where you put your faith in Christ. And it's like falling in love. You don't really have a rational certainty at every level, at every time, but there is a kind of existential certainty that can come in. And that's what I would want to commend for people, is that even where you don't necessarily have all your questions answered, there is something that can happen that the Bible talks about as the testimony of the Holy Spirit, that where you can have existential certainty that comes in. There can be an assurance that come in. So I guess I want to encourage people too. You're not necessarily going to be stuck with angst forever. it is possible to push through that and for God to use that in your life. One other quick thing is I've got a video coming out next week on my channel about Kierkegaard and intellectual anxiety. And one of the
Mm.
things he talks about is how God uses anxiety to bring us to faith. And so
Mm.
people might be interested in that video, but it's just an encouraging idea too, that this isn't as hard as the anxiety is in the process. God can use that to get us to that place of existential peace and certainty.
That's so good. Let's pull out a little bit to the syllogisms, just for because this is a great conversation, and I could just fully share personal stories, but I kind of want to frame what we're talking about in the way that you did in your original video, where, and I don't know if you have it in front of you, but I think I took a screenshot here where you essentially laid out the sort of the argument presented in the book that is also sort of what Alex is referencing in. Oh, sorry. His actual one was like 7 parts, and you distilled it down to. I guess I could just say it here. 1, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief would not occur. 2, non-resistant non-belief does occur. 3, therefore, a perfectly loving God does not exist. That's a basic version of the argument. I guess my question is why is that wrong? And we've already talked a little bit about it, but just to kind of again pull out from the sort of personal narrative sharing, like at a more argumentative level, why do you think that is a wrong? What's the problem with that argument?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you asking me that because, my video was it was not necessarily cast directly at Schellenberg and at the syllogisms. It was kind of more responding at the same level as like Alex's articulation of it. So this gives me a chance to kind of hone in a little bit and drill down for those who are watching who are more philosophically inclined, who really want that kind of response. What I would say, and that's a good syllogism that collapses some of the more complex expressions of it. I would challenge the first premise, and I would just say it is very far from obvious that if a perfectly loving God exists, there will be no non-resistant non-belief. I mean, think of the colossal act of faith that is in human intuition to conceptualize divine love. Again, Kevin McAllister had an expectation of what love should look like from Old Man Marley, and that was wrong. How much more with an infinite God, where we are finite and we're imposing these expectations from other experiences of love we've had onto an infinite God? How much more do we need caution? It's worth pointing out that this is not a universal intuition of all human beings. It's only in the modern West that this has become a more common argument for atheism.
Mm-hmm.
But the struggle's always been there. So why should we assume that modern Western intuitions are right on this and other intuitions are wrong? How do we know what a perfectly loving God will do, especially when we haven't seen the full story yet and we're still in process of becoming? So I think that in terms of just where the argument, I don't think works as a deductive argument where the premises entail the conclusion. I would just say that that first premise doesn't get off the ground, in my opinion, because it claims to know something we couldn't possibly know,
Mm-hmm.
namely how divine love will always work. I mean, that God would never allow non-resistant non-belief. What if allowing for non-resistant non-belief now and again to occur is actually the better way in the long run to establish meaningful relationship with us? Like we can imagine circumstances where someone might withhold relationship in a way that's actually good for the other party. To over time, maybe their heart softens, and maybe through circumstances you're kind of getting at them indirectly. Everyone in relationships knows, sometimes the indirect pathway is better. And so I think more caution is needed for that first premise. That's where I would challenge the argument. Now, I will say that for someone who feels that is cold comfort and they're like, well, technically, yeah, but it still works as a probabilistic argument, then I think they're right and we need to say more. But I think that point certainly undercuts it as a deductive argument from what I can see.
Okay. And then the second point, and I don't tell me if I'm connecting 2 dots that are different, if I'm jumping ahead here essentially, but I believe it was on the second point where you said it is plausible that God has morally sufficient reasons for giving only adequate rather than overwhelming revelation of himself. And I thought that was a very interesting point, because in order to make the claim that basically, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant belief would not occur. Um, I guess, well, I guess it doesn't directly address that, but essentially what I'm getting at is that wouldn't you have to know all possibilities of how God could possibly deal with people or could possibly reveal himself in order to say that the way that he has chosen to is not the maximally beneficial way for humanity in light of all possible information related to human eternal destiny? And so if you don't have all of if you don't know what all possibilities are, and if you don't know how all of those possibilities would play themselves out in the human story, then how can you make the claim that the way that he has chosen to reveal himself is not the optimal way? Is, I guess, my question, or my response to that idea.
Right. Yeah, I'm 100% with you. Yeah, not only would we need to know all these different possibilities, we would also need to be able to see into the future, it seems, because again, the dynamic kind of narrative component of this, like you think of the how with Home Alone, I keep referencing there's the plot twist where you see, oh, you know, sometimes someone withholding themselves for a season is actually in your best interest in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So we would need to know, and especially when a lot of religions teach that there's such a thing as an afterlife, how could we possibly know? That's where I think the argument, when it's stated as a deductive argument, I think it's fairly, I mean, I don't want to be overconfident. I think it's fairly easy to knock down from a deductive argument, kind of like the problem of evil is. I mean, it just claims to know what an infinite God would do. And there's too many variables for us to be able to have 100% confidence about that. Like an abductive argument or an inference to the best explanation, then I think, then I certainly don't want to have any sort of dismissiveness here, because I think it still needs to be worked through and need to give satisfying responses. But another thing that's relevant to this is, and this is in line with what you're saying, is just God's qualitative uniqueness and difference. It's kind of like if we were to think of like God as like the author of a story. It'd be kind of like Shakespeare's relationship to Hamlet and the other characters in the play or something like that. Well, because he's Shakespeare, he's the author of the play. It wouldn't be shocking if his relationship to the characters was very different. And maybe over time, it's kind of slowly working itself out and this kind of thing. So I think the uniqueness of our relationship to God, with him as this kind of infinite, invisible reality. And I think that also induces caution, because if someone is expecting a more direct kind of revelation of God, then I think it's just fair to point out we need to be cautious about imposing expectations based upon finite relationships, which are qualitatively different, onto our relationship to an infinite God. So that's another just caution-inducing point, I guess, there.
Tell me what you think about this analogy. I just thought of this, but the thought that you just had triggered this. There's two people that just pop into existence in a thick fog, and all there is a single visible signpost that says, go this way, and you will see God. And the one person says, I mean, makes sense to me. I'll go that way. And if they go that way and the fog gets less and less thick, and eventually they do, and the other person says, this is ridiculous. There's absolutely no evidence for God. Why should I believe that signpost? I'm not going to follow that signpost and go in that direction. And then they remain in the fog. This is probably flawed on many levels, but I'm trying to get at the idea that there is some call to action or response that God is asking of us. There is a cosmic ask, and the response to that ask plays some role in the future belief of the person being asked that thing.
Yeah, I like it. And I think that for someone who, let's suppose someone's listening to this and they're saying that call to action is unfair or something like this. I think I want to go back to the idea of conscience as a background consideration even prior to that call to action, because
Mm-hmm.
I think that we're not just completely neutral on this question. We do I would want to, I think this actually does help inform the whole divine hiddenness problem, is that we do actually have some pretty powerful reasons to believe in God. Kant spoke of the starry host above and the moral law within.
Mm,
And as I study these things, whether it's in the more technical argumentation about the fine tuning of the physical constants of our universe, or the contingency argument, which I think is very intuitive and very powerful, or whether it's in these more poignant personal and relational ways, like the way conscience, I think, is a testimony, or some of the other arguments. I think a good argument can be made from history for Christ as for a divine explanation of Christ, for both from his claims and both from the start of the Christian church and the claims of his followers about his resurrection. I've kind of been amazed. I really went into my study on those things thinking, that's probably not all that great, and I was amazed. As an abductive argument, I think you can make a strong appeal, not a absolutely airtight appeal, but I think you can make a very strong appeal, and then you combine these things in cumulative weight. So I would say, to me, it helps to just remember, when we are facing this call to action, we're not asking someone to take an irrational leap or an arbitrary choice. I think we can make this fair appeal to our friends. What is the best decision in light of what you do know? What's even if it's only 60-40 or 55-45, which way does the arrow of evidence incline?
mm-hmm.
And I would say that, one thing that a fair appeal is that we shouldn't expect total certainty until we're acting on what we do have certainty about, and starting down the pathway of responsiveness to what seems to be the best explanation of our universe and our lives and so forth. And so, that to me is a background consideration that informs all of this, is that these testimonies to God. In other words, it's going back to Pascal's point. There's enough light for those who want to see, and there's enough darkness for those who don't want to see.
Yeah.
Well, that light, if you take a look long enough at it, it's pretty good. I mean, some of these arguments are pretty powerful. The fine tuning argument, I mean, it's powerful. It's a powerful appeal. So those things, I think, for again, as someone who's struggling with this, keep looking at those arguments. Those might be friends to you along the way as you're kind of working through this stuff.
I think what you just said there is amazing. And as we're running up towards the end of the time here, I want to, another thing that you brought up in your other video that I think is so important is sort of this idea of Pascal's wager, which I feel is often memeified or laughed at or taken as something that is supposed to prove or show more than it was ever intended to. But I want to just say, in light of the conversation that we've had, why is Pascal's wager a relevant or important place to land the plane?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Pascal's wager sometimes is misunderstood or caricatured, especially when it's, like you say, people expect too much of it. I think Pascal is highlighting the implications of either choice, but to believe in God or not to believe in God, and what is at stake. And I think he's really casting that toward the person who is in indecision, which is something we've already addressed here, that we're not necessarily, giving these appeals to the person who's totally closed off, but it's to that person who's kind of struggling. And I think what I love about Pascal's wager is just the practical sensibility of it, that we all do have to make some kind of decision about this ultimate question. We have to wager, in a sense, even if that decision is just, I'm not going to think about it. That's a particular choice that we will make. And so the question then becomes, well, what are the implications of that decision that we make? And there's a great scene in That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis, which is one of my favorite books of fiction. And basically a character is an atheist, but he's like, he's being kind of mistreated in these bizarre ways. And one of the things his captors make him do is to like spit on and insult a crucifix of Jesus. And the thought comes into him because he's had this profound experience of morality, and he's come to believe there is goodness out there, and he's kind of on his way to God. And the thought comes into him where he basically says, I know this man must have existed. Okay, let's suppose that he was just an ordinary human, good person who found out that the universe is a cheat. And he says, why not go down with the ship? Why not just choose goodness and go down with Christ? And basically, even if he's not real and there is no ultimate hope or afterlife. And I love that, because it's a way of showing, again, the implications of like, yeah, why not just go that route? In other words, I guess it raises the question of what is really worthy of your allegiance. And then the question comes up is like, well, what if it's true? I mean, isn't it worth? And that's where I would say, even if someone is only 20% open to believing in God, that's enough, or even less than that, to make you keep thinking about it and reading books about it and talking with people about it and exploring it, because so much is at stake. I mean, if there's an infinite, eternal reverberation of glory and beauty that we call the glory of God, that every other good experience we've had in our lives is just the tiniest glimpse of. And like it's whispering to us in our best experiences. If that's really out there, it's worth everything to search for and to think about and to give ourselves to. And so Pascal's wager raises those kind of practical implications of the choice. And that's where I would say if someone's 50-50, keep going because because of all that is at stake with this. And that's where the happiness and beauty of the gospel can be a powerful motivation for us, because if we really believe Jesus rose from the dead and everything sad is going to come untrue, and even the sadness in our lives will somehow turn to glory, that's worth. And that's where I'd say to people, just keep thinking about it and keep exploring it and keep searching and keep praying. At least don't stop the search, because it highlights how important these issues are. So anyway, it's been fun to dialogue about all this with you.
Well, I love that too. My last thought is that something I think is so powerful about that is that it forces one to consider the potential limitations of their own viewpoint. The lens that you're looking through, might it have some smears on it? Is there something that you might not see? Or do you think that you have perfect clarity on all future possibilities? Because often you talk to atheists and they say, well, I don't want to live forever. That sounds terrible. I don't want to be with God. That sounds miserable. He's a moral monster, and why would I want to be with him forever? That's hell. I would rather just not exist. But again, isn't even that claim rooted in a particular viewpoint, a particular understanding based on particular experiences, particular books that have been read, particular relationships that have been had, particular wounds that have been endured? Isn't that itself a very finite viewpoint? And obviously you have to acknowledge that your viewpoint is finite. I have to acknowledge that my viewpoint is finite. But the Pascal's wager for all people causes you to consider what you do know, what you have experienced, and what you might not know and have not experienced. And it's essentially saying, just be humble enough to see that and play towards what might be true that you just don't know yet. And so I love it for that reason, because it really, I guess the word that I'm getting at is humility. It really causes you to consider humility. And I think that's a very powerful portal towards revelation, basically. So those are my last thoughts. Gavin, it's been amazing. We got to do this again. I love talking to you. I love talking to people that are smarter than me and willing to allow me to take up their time.
I love the conversation. Let's definitely stay in touch. You've got an awesome YouTube channel, and I feel like we're kindred spirits in some of the things we're aiming towards here. So let's stay in touch and just keep it going.
Sounds like a plan.